In this video, I'm going to talk about frequency histograms and frequency distributions, and we're going to do an example where we make one of both of these. And so we're first going to look at this example, and this example gives us a list of scores on a quiz. So we have some quiz scores here. And in part A, it asks us to show the frequency distribution, and B asks us to draw a frequency histogram, and then C, we have a follow-up question. So what is a frequency distribution? Well, a frequency distribution, or the frequency distribution of a variable, tells you all the possible values that a variable can take on and the frequency that each of the possible values occurs. So let's back up a minute. So all the possible values the variable can take on. So if we look at this example with quiz scores, we can ask ourselves, well, what are all the possible values that someone could get on a quiz? Well, we don't know much about this quiz. It doesn't give us any other information other than the data. But looking at this data, I can look at, the scores and see that my lowest score is 15. And then it looks like my highest score is 19.5. And so, about 15 to 19.5 would be the range of that data. And so when I make my frequency distribution, I can think of all the possible values, well, somewhere between 15 and 19.5. So I want to make sure that that's included. So you can see here on the left-hand side where it says classes, we have, they're partially filled out. And so all of these classes are going to have a range. So they're going to start at one number and end at another. And then what we're going to do is we're going to find the frequency that each of the possible values occurs. So how many scores are between these two numbers in the class? And so let's start there. So let's go through, and what we're going to do is we're going to fill out this column here where it says classes. And how we're going to do that is we're going to look at these ending values. They all end in whole numbers. And so I'm actually going to start at the second class here. And then I'll work my way down and come back to that first one. And so if the first class ends at 15, then that means I have to start the next class at the next available number after 15. Well, there are a lot of numbers after 15. I mean, I could start it at 15.1, 15.01, 15.001. There are many choices. This is where, I have some say. I'm the one making this chart. It doesn't give me any direction here in my instructions. So I'm going to look at my data. And since my data at the most is rounded to one decimal place, I am going to choose to start it at 15.1. If my data was rounded to some of the scores were rounded to, maybe the hundredths place, then I might start at 15.01. But I'm just going to label my classes consistent with how the data looks. And so 15.1 to 16. And then I'm going to start my next class at 16.1 to 17. And then 17.1 to 18, and 18.1 to 19, and 19.1 to 20. And then we can come up here and see if we just look at this pattern, it goes from 19.1 to 18 to 17, 16, 15. So this is going to be 14.1 to 15. And there's nothing to say that I had to make my classes like this. Could I have made them 14 to 14.9 and 15 to 15.9? Absolutely. So if the directions don't state how you specifically have to label or start and end your classes, then you can pick whatever way makes most sense to you. And so now that I'm done labeling all my classes, now I'm going to go through and I'm going to find the frequency. How many numbers are in each class? And so I could go through each class one at a time, but that to me takes a little bit longer. So what I like to do is I like to go through the scores one at a time and ask myself, well, what is the frequency for, or what class does that score belong in? So if I start in this first score, 18.4, and I look down my list, well, that's between 18.1 and 19. So I'm just going to use tally marks and put a tally mark there. And then I cross it off. And then I go to the next one, 20. Well, that's in the very last class. So I put a tally mark there. So this would be a great time for you to go through all of these scores and fill out the frequency chart. Okay, so now that I've finished all of the frequency column, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put just numerical values next to each of the tally marks to make it a little bit easier to see the number of values or the frequency for each category. Okay, so now that I have my frequency distribution done, now I'm ready to do a frequency histogram. So let's talk about what a frequency histogram is. So a frequency histogram is like a bar graph, but it's a little bit different. The horizontal axis is a number line instead of oftentimes a bar graph can have categories. So for example, a typical bar graph might look something like this, where maybe you have categories at the bottom. So maybe the categories at the bottom are favorite food, and maybe you have bars to represent the amount of people that like certain food categories. Okay, so maybe this one's pizza and burgers and so on. And so, bar graphs can be vertical, they can be horizontal. Usually in bar graphs, the bars don't touch because they represent certain categories, and those categories, are not numerical categories. They're not categories that take on numbers. And so with a histogram, it's a little bit different. So the bottom, the x-axis is a number line, and the x-axis represents ranges or classes. And so when one class ends, the other class begins. And so in a histogram, the bars will touch. And so a histogram is going to look a little bit like this. So it still looks like a bar graph, but the bars touch each other, and you have a number line on the bottom represent the classes. And then on the vertical axis, so the y-axis, this is always going to be the frequency. And so let's go ahead and make a frequency histogram for the frequency distribution that we just created for the quiz scores. So I'm going to start by drawing my axes. And I always want to put the classes on the horizontal axis or the x-axis. And since my first class starts at 14.1, I'm not going to start at 0. So I'm going to go out a little bit there. And I'm just going to make a space to represent each class. And then I'm going to write in the class. So 14.1 to 15. And then my next class, 15.1 to 16. And then my next class, 16.1 to 17. And then my next class, 17.1 to 18. And then 19.1 to 20. And so now that I have all my classes, I'm going to write the frequency on the vertical axis. And so since my frequencies go from 2 to 9, I'm just going to go ahead, I'll start it at 0 and I'll go all the way up by 1. So 1, 6, 7, 8, and then 9. Okay. And then I'm just going to make bars just like you would a bar graph, except the bars are going to touch. And so I'm going to come up here to this first class. The frequency was 2. So I'm going to go to that first class and make a bar that goes all the way up to 2. And then my second class, the frequency was also 2. So I just make a bar that goes to 2 with it touching the previous class. The third class, it looks like I have 3. The fourth class, I have 3. The fifth class, I have 9. And then the sixth class, I have 7. And so that would be what the histogram looks like for these quiz scores. And the nice thing about it, it can give you some insight into the data. So we can see here that, our largest class was 18.1 to 19. So we had most people scoring in the 18 to 19 range in terms of the quiz scores. And then I would say, our next biggest class is the 19.1 to 20. So it says overall, we had more scores in the higher range. So that, could potentially be good. I mean, we don't know what these scores represent. We don't know that 18 to 19 or 19 to 20 is necessarily good, but based on the information we have, we can see that those are the highest classes. And that's basically what Part C asks. So Part C asks, based on the histogram, what class of scores occurs most often? It asks us to use whole numbers. And so we can see from this histogram that the class that occurs most often would be this class. It'd be 18.1 to 19. Since it asks to use whole numbers, then I would just say the class 18 to 19.